Hello friends, welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's very exciting sewing video and tutorial, which is none other than one of my favorite types of sewing projects and sewing tutorials to create and share with all of you, and that is a designer thrift flip, a sewing project inspired by an item of clothing that is way out of my budget that I could never afford. But given the fact that I know how to sew and love to create my own clothes, I always love to give myself a bit of a challenge and try to create my own version of designer pieces that I love. And if you've been around here for any amount of time, you know that that is something that I am incredibly passionate about, is helping you to create and curate wardrobe that you love with it always being on a budget. And so that's kind of the inspiration behind all of my sewing projects and tutorials, is showing you that you can actually create pieces that you love, those pieces that you've been pinning on Pinterest that you're seeing everyone wearing on social media, but maybe it's out of your budget. You can actually create it for yourself. And that's what we're doing today with none other than a beautiful Damson Madder dress. Now, this is not my first Damson Madder thrift flip, so if you're curious about any of the other Damson Madder projects that I have done in the past, I will link all of those videos down below. Damson Madder is a brand that I really adore their styles. I love their silhouettes. As a brand, I generally love their philosophy. They are a much more smaller label, so when it comes to more ethical practices, small batches of clothing, they are a brand that you would really want to support because they are doing the right thing and they're putting out generally high quality pieces of clothing. I always see a lot of fashion and style bloggers and influencers that I follow on social media wearing Damson Madder pieces, and I'm always saving those outfits and pinning them on Pinterest to give me ideas for sewing projects. And one of the latest pieces from Damson Madder is a dress. It's called the Josephine midi dress, and I absolutely love everything about this dress. This is a picture of it. So it is a midi length, which I love when it comes to dresses. It's a really pretty stripe, so it's kind of a cream fabric with a red and blue stripe mix. I love the pin tucks at the bottom of the hem. I'm a sucker for pin tucks. I also love the oversized collar and the ruffly detail around the collar, and the fact that this collar is not just a Peter Pan collar. It kind of has this fun square boxy shape. I think it's just so fun. So we're gonna try and remake this dress. Now, obviously one of the challenging things when it comes to kind of remaking a designer piece is trying to find fabric that is as similar to the original if you are trying to kind of go with the original aesthetic. So I was trying to kind of find a fabric that would fit that as closely as possible. And one day when I was thrifting, I came across this blue and red striped sheet. And this is the sheet that I thrifted. So as you can see, it has that light pastel-y blue, which is very similar to the original dress. It also has these red, really tiny red stripes. They're a little bit darker than the original red, but you still have the red in there. And then this sheet has a little bit of navy. But overall, this fit kind of the original stripe pattern very, very closely. And I was so excited to find this. You all know that I love to use thrifted sheets as my fabric for projects. One, because it is very sustainable, and two, because it is very budget friendly. So for example, this sheet is $3.99. It's 100% cotton, and if I were to try to go out and find 100% cotton fabric with at least 2 to 3 yards of fabric, I would be paying way more than $3.99 just per yard. And this is an entire sheet for $3.99. So this is the fabric that I'm going to be using to recreate the Josephine Damson Madder dress. Now for this specific dress, I was considering self-drafting a pattern or hacking patterns that I already had. But then I was on Instagram one day and I was posting about the Josephine dress from Damson Madder on my Instagram stories and talking about how I wanted to remake it, and Christine from The Ordinary Folk messaged me and she was like, hey, my new sewing pattern, the Juni dress, would actually be a perfect hack for this Josephine dress. And I had already had my eye on Christine's Juni dress because I generally love the shape of it, but I hadn't even considered hacking it for this Damson Madder dress, and it's actually the perfect pattern and will save me so much time when it comes to pattern hacking because all I have to do is change the shape of the collar. So So for this designer thrift flip project, I'm going to be using the Juni dress pattern by The Ordinary Folk. I will link all the details for that pattern down below. And I love the fact that just changing the shape of the collar is going to turn this dress into a very similar version as the Damson Madder dress. Now, aside from the shape of the collar, the only other thing that I'm going to have to change about the Juni dress in order to make it look like the Damson Madder dress is lengthen the skirt and add in all of those pin tucks that were at the bottom of the dress. The original Damson Madder dress actually closes with buttons in the front, and then it has a little tie right at the collar, so I don't have to change the button plackets that are in the Juni dress. I can essentially just follow her pattern instructions and then make adaptations along the way to make it mirror as closely as possible the Josephine Damson Madder dress. So enough chatting, let's dive into the fun part of this project, which is actually sewing it up.
And now it's time for a quick ad break brought to you by Sewing Parts Online.
Did your favorite fabric store just close down and now you're wondering, where am I going to get all my sewing supplies? Well, I'm right there with you. And that's why I'm so excited to tell you about Sewing Parts Online, an online website that is your one-stop shop for all things sewing. Whether you need notions for an upcoming project, are looking for a specific sewing tool, need to restock your thread supply, or simply want to source fabric by the yard, Sewing Parts Online has you covered and won't miss a stitch. Kind of like your overlocking machine. And if you're anything like me, you might use your sewing machine so much that you eventually need to replace old or broken parts. Well, that's what Sewing Parts Online specializes in. With knowledgeable support just a click away, no matter your sewing machine brand or model, Sewing Parts Online can help you find the parts you need, allowing your sewing machine to get back up and running and your sewing project back on track without the mental breakdown. Because sewing is meant to be your happy place after all. What once started out as a family-run sewing machine store has now become an accessible online resource for sewists and quilters around the country. So grab your sewing machine, settle into your creative space, and make something wonderful. Sewing Parts Online will be right there when you need them.
The first step in creating this Damson Madder dress is to create a new collar shape. I decided to use the base collar from the Juni dress and then draw out my straight square collar from there. I'm using all of the important lines like the cut on fold line and the neckline to create my base of my new square collar, and then I'm going to figure out the length I want my new square collar to be. I found it helpful to overlay the original collar over the front of the bodice to figure out how long the square collar needed to be based on the original dress as a reference. After looking at that photo, I decided to make my square collar 7 inches long down the front, and I'm going to do the same for the back. I'm keeping the side width of my collar the same as the original Peter Pan, except I am just extending those lines so that they will connect to the 7-inch length down the front. And as you can see, I'm now squaring off the collar in the front and in the back. After drafting out pattern pieces, I always like to go back over my pencil lines with a Sharpie so that I can really see where all the pattern markings are and have a really crisp shape. I made sure to transfer the important pattern markings like the grain line, the cut on fold line, and also the notch along the neckline for matching up the bodice to the collar. And for a reference, here is the original Peter Pan oversized large collar, and here is my square collar for my hack.
Alright, I now have all of the pattern pieces printed and assembled. Now for this pattern, because I'm technically hacking it to fit the design of the Damson Madder dress, I'm only going to be using certain pieces from the original Juni dress. I'm going to be using the back panel. I'm going to be using the front panel, and it's going to be the front that has the button placket. There are actually two different front bodice options for this pattern. Since the original dress has buttons down the front, I'm going to be using the button placket. And the main hack and tweak that I am doing for the Juni dress is I am changing the shape of the collar. So you already saw that in the video where I essentially traced out the original collar since it fits the neckline of the bodice, but then I tweaked it and redrew it into a more sailor collar squared shape. So this is going to be my new collar piece to match the Damson Madder dress, and as you can see, it is very much that square shape. Now this pattern has a couple of different sleeve options. Since the Damson Madder dress is sleeveless, I'm not going to have to sew the sleeves. And then the last tweak that I have to make is to the skirt. The original Damson Madder skirt is a midi length with 3 pin tucks at the bottom. Based on the picture, it looks like the pin tucks are probably about 1 inch to 1.5 inches like long. I'm going to make my pin tucks 1 inch. I'm going to see if I have enough fabric in the sheet to cut the skirt long enough to make 3 pin tucks. So that is the next thing I'm going to do, is measure out the skirt shape. Now, the next thing I need to do for this dress is figure out the length and width of my skirt piece. This dress obviously comes with a skirt pattern piece, but since it's essentially just a giant square, I didn't really want to print out all of those pattern pieces, and I'm tweaking the skirt length as it is, so I'm just going to go based off of my own kind of standard measurements when creating really simple gathered waist skirts for dresses or skirts themselves. Okay, so to figure out the length of the skirt, typically when I'm making midi length skirts, I usually make them about 37 inches. For me, I'm about 5'10", and usually that is a good length to make my skirts. Then I obviously account for seam allowance for the hem. Now, I obviously didn't print out the skirt pattern pieces, so I don't have anything in front of me to measure, but looking at the print guide in the pattern directions, I can see that the skirt pattern pieces take up about 3 1/4 pieces of paper, and I know that traditional copy paper is 11 inches long. So doing the math, adding up all of those pieces of paper, I got that the original maxi skirt was about 41.25 or 41 1/4 inches long for my size, which is size D. So basically, if I were to add my hem seam allowance to the 37 inches, I would come into the range of it being around 41. I think that I'm actually going to go with my traditional 37 inches. I want about a 1 inch hem, so I'm going to add in 2 additional inches, taking me to 39, so we're already getting close to 41. Now, the main thing is my pin tucks. I want to sew 3 pin tucks that are 1 inch each, and each pin tuck, even if it is 1 inch, is going to be folded with fabric, so it's going to take up 2 inches of fabric. So essentially, I have my 3 pin tucks times 2 gets me 6, which is going to be 6 inches. So I need to add 6 inches to the 39 inches for my skirt length. Now you could do your own calculations, measure out the length you want of your skirt, add 2 inches for your kind of hem and gathering allowance, and then add in 6 additional inches for your pin tucks. Now I'm going to lay out all my pattern pieces that I need and measure out my skirt measurements in my sheet to see if I can actually count for 3 pin tucks. If not, I'm going to take it down to 2. Because now 39 inches plus my 6 inches for my pin tucks gets me 45 inches long for my skirt. So I'm going to make sure that my math works out, and then I'll come back and check in with you. The other pattern piece that I do have to tweak for this pattern is the ruffle for the collar. So there is a ruffle piece for the collar. This is based on the original oversized Peter Pan collar. Now, my typical mathematical calculation for figuring out a ruffle for something is to take the length of that piece and then multiply it by 1.3. I feel like that typically gets me a really good ruffle that's like not too ruffly, but not enough ruffles and bunching. So I'm going to measure around my collar and do that calculation to figure out just how long a piece of fabric I need for my ruffle. Chances are I'm going to be cutting it into multiple pieces and sewing it together because I probably won't have enough fabric to cut that ruffle in all one piece.
Since I was working with this entire sheet and having to figure out all the measurements and if I was going to be able to cut my skirt long enough, I had to work on the floor. But what sewist doesn't lay down on the floor with fabric to figure out pattern placements and cut out their pattern pieces? I ended up having plenty of fabric to cut my skirt the long length that I wanted and plenty of fabric to cut out all my pattern pieces with some to spare. After all of my pattern pieces were cut out, it was time to transfer all the important pattern markings, especially the 2 lines down the front of the bodice for the button placket, and then the darts on the side of the bodice. My first step in creating this dress is working on the collar. The first thing I do for my collar is take my fusible interfacing and I'm going to fuse it to the wrong side of the under portion of my collar. After this is fused, then I'm going to start working on the collar ruffle. So now my interfacing is fused to my collar. This is just going to give it some nice stability. And I'm going to work on my collar ruffle. Since this is requiring a very long piece of fabric, I cut my fabric into 4 different sections, and I first have to sew all those sections together to create one continuous strip. To complete my ruffle construction, I followed the directions in the original pattern for how I was supposed to finish the edges and how I was supposed to fold my fabric to create that kind of 1-inch chunky ruffle. Now I'm going to go sew in 2 rows of basting stitches so that I can start gathering this together to attach it. And now that my basting stitches are sewn into the top raw edge of my ruffle, I can start the long and tedious process of creating a very, very long ruffle. Once I adequately gathered my ruffle piece so that it fit around the entire edge of my square collar, I then am going in and I'm starting to pin this ruffle around my collar. Now I am pinning this ruffle piece to the under portion of the collar that has the interfacing. I'm going to sew the ruffle down before I attach the other collar piece, which is essentially going to allow the ruffle to be sandwiched between 2 layers. So I'm pinning it all the way around, making sure to pay special attention to the corners so that they have a really good squared effect. And now that my ruffle is sewn down to the first layer of the collar, I'm going to take my other collar piece that doesn't have interfacing and I'm going to turn that face down onto the piece of the collar that has the ruffles. And as you can see, I'm just going to pin all the way around the edges, right sides together. Now before flipping my collar right side out, I'm going to clip or snip the corners that are really squared. This is going to allow my corners to actually be able to lay really nicely and squared once I flip it out. I'm also going to trim all of those edges. So once the corners are clipped and the seams are trimmed, I'm going to flip my collar right side out and I'm going to use the tool to just kind of poke out those corners so that they actually have a very defined square shape. And once my collar is flipped right side out, it's time to give it a nice press. And here's what that collar looks like after a nice iron. As you can see, the ruffles turn out perfectly and all of the corners are so nice and square.
All right, I just finished sewing the ruffle around the collar and it's so cute. This collar is like the focal piece of this dress and I am obsessed. So I'm going to set this aside and now start working on the bodice so that I can then attach the collar to it.
Setting the collar aside, I'm now starting to work on the bodice, and the first step on the bodice is to pin together and sew the darts on the side. I'm matching up my dart lines, putting pins along those lines, and then I'm going to sew them from the widest edge of the dart to the narrowest. Now after my darts were sewn and pressed, it's now time to work on my button plackets. The directions for the Juni dress say to fold these in 4/5 of an inch, press it, and then you're going to fold it another 4/5 of an inch. So that's what I'm doing here. This is really great construction because you don't have to have an additional button placket piece. It's already part of the front. So I really, really like that. I put pins into my fabric and I'm going to sew my button placket down from the right side of my fabric. After my button plackets were sewn into place, it was then time for me to figure out my button placement. I ended up putting these buttons about 2 inches apart, which is usually standard placement for buttons. The first button was about 3/8 of an inch from the top, and then I just measured those 2 inches apart down the front. And then it was time to sew my buttonholes. Now, my Juni sewing machine has an automatic buttonhole foot, which is one of my favorite things about the sewing machine. Essentially, once you put all of the functions into place, you just hit the foot pedal and the sewing machine from start to finish sews the entire buttonhole. Now that the front of my bodice is complete, it's time to attach the back by pinning and sewing the shoulders and the side seams together. I'm going to sew these on 3/8 of an inch and then finish those seams with my overlocking machine. For now, I'm going to set my bodice aside until later, and I'm going to work on attaching the pockets to the sides of my skirt, and then I'm going to start working on my pin tuck placements.
Okay, so before I sew the side seams of the skirt together, I am pausing to draw on my lines for the pin tucks. As you remember, this Damson Madder dress has 3 layers of 1-inch pin tucks. That's what it looks like, but they're 1 inch, so that's what I'm going with. And so I cut my skirt long enough to sew in those 3 pin tucks into my skirt. So I decided that I wanted my first pin tuck to be 8 inches from the hem of my skirt, which actually means I need to draw the line for the first pin tuck 9 inches up, because the pin tucks fold and then fold over the amount that the pin tuck is wide. So I'm going to make a mark 9 inches up right here from the bottom, and then my pin tucks are 1 inch once they are sewn, which means I need to use 2 inches to create them. So I'm going to draw a line for 2 inches, and then I like to put like a little arrow for where I'm going to sew them together. And again, then we have to figure out the distance between each sewn pin tuck, because again, once they're sewn, they fold over the amount that that pin tuck is, and these are 1 inch. So I need 2 inches in between every pin tuck so that there's just 1 inch of regular fabric. So I'm going to mark these 2 inches here, another 2 inches for my pin tuck, and do my arrow so I know where I'm going. Then another 2 inches, and then another 2 inches. And these are the measurements for my pin tucks. Now I might actually go in and figure out where the center of my pin tuck is. Sometimes it's easier to actually just fold your fabric along a center line and use the 1 inch seam allowance line on your sewing machine rather than having to draw so many lines. So sometimes that's really helpful, but I do find that knowing where the top and the bottom of your pin tuck is, so that you could either match those up or know the spacing, is really helpful. So then they're gonna go like that.
And here's my process of drawing in all my lines for my pin tucks. This part is really hard to kind of explain to people. I feel like if you're a visual learner, it will make more sense. But essentially, I went through and I figured out where the center of every 2 inches for my pin tucks was, and that's actually the line that I'm drawing in, and that's what I'm going to fold and then sew on my sewing machine. But in order to find that center line placement, I also have to know where the tops and the bottoms of my pin tucks are. Now before I actually start sewing my pin tucks together, I first need to sew the sides of my skirt together, matching up those side seams, and then sewing down and around my pockets.
Okay, so the sides of my skirt are sewn together and I finished the seams. Now I'm going to be going in and actually sewing the pin tuck. So as you already saw in the video, I already put all of my lines for my markings for my pin tucks. There's different methods, like I said, that you can apply in regards to how you draw your lines and then how you pin them and sew them. I personally, the more that I have done this, have really preferred just having a center line, essentially a line where the bottom of the pin tuck would be, where the fabric would be folded. So for example, so I have this line right here, and as the center line I just fold it along that line, and then I don't actually have to pin my pin tuck because I know my pin tuck is going to be 1 inch. So I just use the 1 inch seam allowance guide on my sewing machine, so it makes sewing the pin tucks a little bit quicker because I'm not having to pin everything, and I know that I am just looking for that center line, folding it, and that's going to be the bottom edge of my pin tuck, and then sewing my 1 inch seam allowance. In the past I have drawn lines on both sides of that center line and then essentially pinned where those lines would match up on both sides of the fabric. So for example, there's a line right there. If I had another line on the other side, I would then pin through those lines, knowing that it would be creating my 1 inch pin tuck. So again, there are a lot of different methods, so definitely play around with it and figure out what works for you. But like I said, I personally have started to just use the center line, not pin it, and sew it with the 1 inch seam allowance. I'm also a sewist who kind of tries to cut corners as much as I can in a smart way. So this is one of those ways to do that.
And as you can see, I am not using pins. And again, that's because these pin tucks are 1 inch, so I can very easily just fold my fabric and sew them using the 1 inch seam allowance guide on my metal needle plate. And similarly to sewing basting stitches for gathers, sewing pin tucks is a tedious process because there are just a lot of seams that you are sewing multiple times. For example, in this dress, we are sewing really long seams 3 times in a row. After all of my pin tucks were sewn, I took my skirt over to my iron to give them all a very nice press, and also to disappear the lines for the pin tuck, since I was using my Pilot friction erasable pins, which are my favorite thing for marking on fabric because they disappear with an iron. Alright, I just finished sewing the bias tape into and around the armholes of this bodice. The Juni dress was originally created to have different options for sleeve styles, but since I'm making this to obviously look like a Damson Madder dress, the original dress doesn't have sleeves. So I need to finish those raw edges, so all I did was just sew white bias tape to the right side and then flip it to the inside to cover over all of those seams. So now that the armholes are done, I can start attaching the collar to the neckline of this bodice, and then once that is done, the bodice is going to get attached to the skirt, and then this dress is finished. Now for attaching the collar to the bodice, I followed the instructions for the original Juni dress. Actually, for most of these steps, I'm following the original instructions, and for attaching the collar, it was definitely helpful to have that visual. Essentially, I am placing the collar around the neckline, just normally, right side to right side, and then I am pinning bias tape around those raw edges, and the bias tape is then going to flip in to encase those seams around the neckline. Now that my bias tape around the neckline is pinned into place, I'm going to sew that around the neckline using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. After the bias tape was sewn around the neckline, I then pressed it in towards the wrong side of the inside of the bodice, pinned it into place, and then that bias tape pinned towards the inside is going to be sewn from the right side of the fabric right underneath the collar, so you won't even see the seam. And then I couldn't help adding a personalized tag into this dress so that I can remind myself that I made it. And here's what the inside of my bodice looks like once I attach my collar and sew that bias tape. Next, I'm going to pin my little ties just right underneath the top of the collar. I actually pinned them along the seams for the sides of the button placket and then just sewed those into place. Now the last step is just attaching my skirt to my bodice. I already gathered my skirt off screen, so I'm just matching up the side seams of my skirt with the side seams of my bodice, pinning it all together, and then I'm going to sew that on my sewing machine and finish those raw edges on my serger. By this point, the vision of this dress is definitely starting to come together, and the last finishing touch on making this dress perfect is sewing on all of the buttons. Now, the original Damson Madder Josephine dress had fabric covered buttons, which means that they were covered with fabric from the actual dress and kind of were camouflaged into the actual design. And I think that if I can pick up a packet of those sometimes, I would like to make those and then re-sew them onto this dress so that they aren't quite as noticeable. However, I don't mind how these little white buttons ended up turning out, and then I also used a contrasting blue thread to sew them, so I thought that was kind of fun. And the buttons were the last step in creating this Damson Madder inspired dress, so now it's time to see what this dress officially looks like on. Okay, what do we think? I am so pleased with how this dress turned out. I always love a project that just truly fits the vision in my head, especially those projects that I am basing on a piece that already exists. And I feel like this dress is like copy and paste the original Damson Madder dress, give or take some color variations, but I absolutely adore how it turned out. The pin tucks are perfection. This collar is an absolute dream, and I feel like I am just going to want to wear this every single day this summer. The Juni dress pattern by The Ordinary Folk was truly the perfect base pattern for this dress, and I can't wait to just make the Juni dress in general, but I definitely am feeling like I need another variation of this large square collar dress with pin tucks at the bottom because it's so chic. So I would love to hear from you. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you think about this sewing tutorial and project and this dress. Do you think it looks like the original? Would you make this yourself? Are you now adding it to your list? Tell me all of the things in the comments. And also, if you ever have project ideas for me to do designer thrift flips, definitely let me know what you want to see me make next. Thank you so much for tuning in to watching today's video. If you liked what you saw, give this video a thumbs up and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more videos in the future. I'll see you in the next video, and happy sewing!